if you haven't noticed, I like nuance. If you still haven't noticed that, you probably need to watch more of my videos. But if you prefer going back to watching hypersexualized underage Japanese schoolgirls swinging sword-like objects the size of motorcycles, that's okay too, I guess. I'm not gonna judge. Yeah, that was a lie. This video is sponsored by Skillshare, which is an online learning community with thousands of classes on various creative topics. If you're a curious person always looking to learn more, you can delve into graphic design, photography, animation, film and music production, writing, web development, etc. For example, if you want to start a YouTube channel about whatever you're passionate about, there's a class by MKBHD, one of the biggest tech YouTubers, about video making. He covers the essentials from researching and scripting to setup, filming, and growing your channel in 11 concise lessons. It also goes to show the potential for self-taught individuals to make it big, even without going to film school. Skillshare keeps adding new classes, and there are no ads, so you can just keep focusing on improving yourself. The first 1,000 viewers to click on the link in the description down below will get a free trial of premium membership to get started on either exploring something new or leveling up your existing skills. So what form of nuance are we chasing today? Well, it's about armor again. A lot of people like knights, right? Basically tanks on two legs, indestructible fighting machines of the battlefield. On the one extreme. On the other extreme, they're basically wearing cardboard that can easily be cut through by a katana. Whenever you're trying to educate people about historical arms and armor, or in my case, entertain and educate on the side, I suppose, it's easy to fall for overstatements or provoke overstatements. For example, when talking about how effective plate armor is, which I've done in the past, and pointing out that swords have very limited effectiveness against plate, or at least pointing out that you can't just cut straight through it the way it often happens in movies, it's easy to cause people to go on the other extreme and claim that you're basically invulnerable as soon as you put on plate armor, the same way as if you point out that plate armor isn't as heavy and cumbersome as you may think and as was previously incorrectly imagined. People take it again to the extreme and overstate, basically downplaying the encumbrance of armor at all. Like, oh no, you can walk around in plate armor and move the exact same way, it doesn't hinder you at all. So those extreme statements are obviously inaccurate, but there's quite a bit in between, right? So how do we hone in on the most precise way of putting it? What I'm trying to get here is exactly the idea of plate armor being, undefeatable with a sword, essentially, unless you're using specific techniques, which I've made another video about, things like exploiting gaps and half sorting, murder stroke, etc. But it doesn't really end there. This clip here is an example of how it can go down if you're overly confident with your armor. That was clearly a very painful hit. And this is probably the kind of armor that is actually made thicker than historical originals. You find that generally in Buhurt and similar events where people basically use upscaled armor, modern reproductions that are made noticeably thicker than they were back in history to be safer, essentially, so people can wail on each other and not get too horribly injured. They still get injured every now and then. And personally, I've done enough HEMA sparring to know what it's like to get nailed with a longsword in the head or on the jacket or whatever. Even with protective gear, that can hurt quite a bit. And that's considering that people are generally being careful. They're holding back, you're not hitting each other literally with everything you've got. And sometimes, there are some people who don't quite know the extent of the force they're putting in. And sometimes you have to tell people, hey, ease off a little bit on that. We don't need concussions and all that. people getting incapacitated by strong hits to the head, even through the mask. This is one of those difficult things that we still don't really have a good answer for. If you keep agitating, keep injuring the brain, keep stretching the tissue, that's cumulative over time. It can cause some serious problems. And that is very, very difficult to prevent, because what helmets do is they prevent fractures. They prevent your skull from being cracked, basically, and split open. But they do not really prevent concussions. There's not that much to be done. Adding mass to your head helps, because that limits the acceleration that your head can experience and the kind of trauma to the brain that happens from the sudden acceleration and stoppage. So it can help to an extent, but unless your head is completely stabilized, and there are forms of armor that basically lock your head in place, which has other problems, of course. Then you do the Michael Keaton Batman thing of not being able to turn your head easily, so you have to swivel like a tank turret, basically. But it can help, because if your head cannot move like this, then everything is much more stable, then the risk of injury in that way is lower. If you have plates, hard plates on your arms, for example, a hard hit can, even with a sword, can still cause injury, potentially, if it happens at full force. Now, you always have to keep in mind, whenever someone says you gotta hit harder and that's the way to defeat armor, that's kind of like saying every hit in boxing needs to be a power punch. Everything needs to be a fully committed 100% power cross or hook or uppercut. Something like, forget about jabs, it is not even gonna do it. You can imagine what that would lead to. You would gas out within a minute, basically. I mean, depending on your individual fitness, but not every hit can be the greatest power slug you can muster. And of course, it also depends on the type of sword. Like the side sword, for example, is designed for unarmored dueling, so it's not even really on the table. But if, let's say in a fantasy scenario or whatever, let's say you encounter an enemy with a blade like this, very narrow, pretty thin, not a lot of mass behind it, and you were wearing plate armor, yeah, you could basically kind of laugh at them if they try to cut at you. The only thing you really need to be worried about is the point. But, I mean, even this against, say, medium armor, if you were wearing mail, there's no way a sword like this is going to cut through. But if somebody really puts power into it and hits you really hard, that's still going to be, depending on where you get struck. Imagine you get hit on the collarbone. That could, even with a sword like this, possibly break, let alone this. Now, some people consider the falchion to be an anti-armor weapon. I wouldn't necessarily agree with that, at least if you're talking anti-plate. Against mail or padded armor, yeah, absolutely. For sure, this will be very effective. Against plate, probably not going to cut through, although, and this is a bit of an odd thing, there are a lot of medieval depictions showing plate armor being just cut straight through. You see plenty of images where someone's helmet is split in half and cut so far down that it draws blood, or they're just being cut to pieces, essentially, even through the armor, which is always a bit questionable. Is this an accurate depiction, or is this deliberate exaggeration for the wow factor? In order to tell a story, make it more epic, etc. This could very well be exaggeration. Maybe some of it happened to an extent. I can imagine if you have poorly made armor or iron armor, like iron helmet or mail rings, and a very high quality steel sword, yeah, it could possibly get through it. Even if you don't, if you strike someone in plate armor with a blade like this, yeah, this is not going to be a fun experience, particularly if you hit the helmet. In a previous video, I talked about single-edged versus double-edged blades, and also talked about how the spine of a single-edged sword can have other purposes It's obviously not going to be a cut, but it can be a blunt instrument. And there was one comment replying to someone else, pointing out that they think it wouldn't do anything, basically. Like, you cannot really damage armor with the spine of a sword. I do disagree with that a little bit, particularly this. I don't know if on the original falchion, these shapes here, if these are decorative or if they have a function. There are a few things I can think of. One would be being able to catch an opponent's sword in here. Another would be possibly as exactly a blunt instrument to strike armor with. I can't prove that. We can't really say for sure what this is intended for. But I could imagine that if you struck someone in the helmet with these, they would concentrate the force on a smaller surface while still being blunt impact. So yeah, you could probably knock someone out if you hit them in the helmet hard enough. The same goes for something like this. Two-handed strike, full power strike with the spine, again, against the head is not going to be a good experience. Against the torso, yeah, it's not going to do that much. Arms and legs, more so. Striking, for example, against the side of the knee, even with the armor, could possibly do something, or it could at least dent it and make it more difficult to move around. Now, gripping it by the blade for the murder stroke and striking with the guard, of course, yes, would be more effective than with the spine, but you shouldn't underestimate just how much oomph that really has. If you have something like this, I still haven't reviewed this because I still won't be able to do any cutting for a while. This is a pretty light sword. When you try to really cause trauma through armor, you do need a bit more mass in the blade. You can have a super light blade and expect it to be that effective. But this is a fairly thick spine. So, and because this is a symmetrical handle, you can flip it around and strike with that and hit as hard as possible. Again, to the joints, possibly the fingers, even in gauntlets, are still quite vulnerable, particularly since I've pointed out before, when they're wrapped around a grip, you're crushing them between the grip and the weapon. So yeah, you should not underestimate how effective a blunt strike with a sword can be, potentially. Reality just has this pesky way of being hard to nail down and being complex. That's why the conclusion can sound different, and always, every single time, stopping for a tangential clarification and disclaimer is a little bit awkward. So sometimes it's better to just cover that in a separate video. So the point is still, plate armor is very effective against swords, obviously, unless you have specialized blades for that purpose that are better at exploiting the gaps. But even so, it's not that they're completely impervious. It's not that you can just tank everything without flinching. Whenever wearing any kind of armor, the main focus is still on not being hit. That's still primarily what you want. And there are types of armor that are really not intended to stop a full strike that you receive. Anyway, I guess that's enough. So in short, armor is great, but it's not perfect. Yay. Insightful point that you could have never figured out on your own. Thanks for watching anyway. I'm out. Underage Japanese schoolgirls wearing tight skirts. No, wait, short skirts. Oh, fuck, whatever. Get out of here. If you prefer, you can also go back to fucking. Yeah, I mean, that's a much better activity than watching videos on YouTube, right? Yeah. What was I saying? What the fuck? Oh my goodness, where was I? Fuck me. I completely lost my train of thought. Have I taken too many hits to the head with swords and sparring? Maybe. Maybe I have.